As the world around me darkened, I felt a pain no man should bear, and faced the deepest emptiness of existence. Yet, in this pivotal moment, a greater purpose was at play. This is the story of the sacrifice that changed eternity, the battle between life and death, and the triumph that defied the laws of existence. Come with me as I reveal, from the depths of my memories, how an empty tomb became the mark of a new covenant. The voices of the crowd were a chaotic mix of fury and despair. "Crucify him," they shouted, as if those words were a release of the accumulated hatred in their hearts. I remained silent, observing every face, every gesture. Some were there to condemn me. Others, like Mary and John, were driven by love and pain. But all, in some way, were connected to that moment, like pieces of a divine puzzle. As I was led out of the city, the weight of the cross seemed to reflect the spiritual weight I carried. My feet dragged along the rocky ground, while sweat and blood streamed down my body. My physical strength was nearly spent, but my resolve remained firm. Simon of Cyrene was forced to help me carry the cross. I watched him approach, hesitant, perhaps fearing being associated with me. But something in his gaze changed when our eyes met. He realized, even if for a moment, that he was part of something greater. At the top of the hill of Golgotha, the sound of the hammer echoed like thunder in my ears. Each strike was indescribable pain, but also a reminder that it was necessary. I looked at Mary, my mother, and saw in her eyes the agony of a mother who never imagined seeing her son like this. Beside her, John held her, trying to hold back tears. "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." My words were both comfort and legacy. They needed to care for one another when I was no longer there. The sky darkened, as if creation itself was weeping. The silence of my connection with the Father weighed heavier than the nails in my hands. My God, why have you forsaken me?" The cry escaped from the depths of my soul, an echo of the psalmist and a reflection of the weight of the sin I bore. When I finally gave up my spirit, the earth trembled. The temple veil tore, and a strong wind swept through the place. The faces of the crowd changed. Hatred gave way to doubt, and silence fell over all. Death had come, but the story was far from over. Death is not what men imagine. It is not simply darkness or emptiness, but a place where time and eternity converge. The moment I gave up my spirit, I felt something I had never experienced before: the complete separation from the Father. It was not permanent, but still an immense pain, an emptiness that seemed infinite. It was the price of the sin I took on. While my body rested in the cold tomb, my essence lingered in a space between heaven and earth. There were no human words to describe that place. It was not absolute silence, but a waiting filled with meaning. I could feel the anxiety of the world. The hearts of my friends were torn apart, while my enemies conspired to ensure my influence ended there. Mary Magdalene could not sleep. In the small house where she was, her thoughts consumed her. How could this happen? He promised us so much. And now? She cried quietly, her mind trying to make sense of a world that suddenly seemed empty. Peter, on the other hand, wrestled with guilt. He remembered the words he had spoken so confidently. "Even if all others abandon you, I will never do so." But he had failed. He had denied me 3 times, and it gnawed at him from within. He wandered the outskirts, unable to face others. Inside the tomb, there was an unusual calm. The linen that wrapped my body was carefully arranged. It was a pause in the midst of a tumultuous story. Though my physical presence was absent, something in the atmosphere indicated that this was not the end. Outside, the Roman soldiers kept watch. They were tense, restless, as though something greater was happening around them. They could not see what was to come, but their hearts felt the imminence of something extraordinary. And so, the world waited, suspended between death and the promise of life. Night fell, and the world seemed to sink into an almost supernatural quiet. Mary Magdalene could not stay away. She approached the tomb once more, even though she knew the entrance was sealed and guarded by soldiers. Her hands gripped a jar of fragrant oil she had prepared. Maybe tomorrow, she thought, I'll be able to enter and tend to his body one last time. But even knowing she couldn't do anything, she couldn't leave. John found her sitting near an olive tree. He approached quietly and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You need to rest, Mary," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "He wouldn't want you to destroy yourself like this." "How can I rest, John?" she replied, tears in her eyes. "Everything he meant to us is over. I can't accept this as the end." John lowered his head, unable to console her. He, too, was struggling to understand. Inside him, there was a spark of hope, but the weight of grief stifled it. "Let's go. We have to trust in what he taught us," he finally said, helping her to stand. Meanwhile, the Roman soldiers at the tomb entrance were uneasy. The night was cold, and the silence around them was disturbing. One of them, named Marcus, looked at the sky and murmured to his companion, "Something's wrong with tonight. It doesn't feel normal." "What do you mean?" asked the other soldier, trying to hide his own anxiety. "Since the earthquake, the sky hasn't felt the same," Marcus replied. "And that man, he wasn't like the others we crucified. There's something different." His companion merely shook his head. "It's not our job to question. We're here to make sure no one steals the body. Do your watch and stay silent." But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the weight he felt. The earth seemed to be holding its breath, and every sound in the distance made the soldiers startle. They had no idea they were witnessing the prelude to something that would change everything. As the world slept, the watch over the tomb continued. For Mary, John, the soldiers, and even the religious leaders, that moment felt eternal. But the third day was already beginning to dawn. The morning air was fresh, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. Inside the tomb, something incomprehensible was about to happen. The light began to fill the space, gentle at first, but quickly growing in intensity until no human eye could withstand it. The stone sealing the entrance began to move, not by the hands of men, but by a celestial force. My essence returned to the body, now glorified. The pain I had endured was but a distant memory. I rose, feeling a new energy, a new life. The tomb that had once seemed a place of defeat was now the stage of an eternal triumph. Outside, the soldiers fell to the ground, unable to bear the sight of what was happening. Marcus tried to rise, but his body trembled in fear. He saw a bright light emanating from the entrance of the tomb and heard a voice that seemed to echo in his spirit. "Do not be afraid." Mary Magdalene arrived shortly afterward, still holding her jar of oil. She stopped abruptly when she saw the stone removed. Her heart raced, and she rushed to the entrance, fear and hope battling within her. When she saw the empty interior, she fell to her knees. "They have taken the body of the Lord," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. Before she could move, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw someone who appeared to be the gardener. "Sir," she said, desperate, "if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." "Mary," I said, softly. She stopped, as if time itself had frozen. That voice. It couldn't be. Slowly, she looked at me again, and her eyes filled with recognition. "Rabbi!" she cried, running to me. Her joy was almost palpable, and she fell at my feet. "Do not touch me yet," I said, helping her to her feet, "for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and tell them that I am alive." Mary paused for a moment, absorbing my words. Then, without hesitation, she ran through the garden, tears of joy streaming down her face. She knew no one would believe her immediately, but that didn't matter. The truth needed to be proclaimed. As she disappeared into the horizon, I stood silently in the garden for a moment. The sun now shone fully, and the world seemed renewed. Death had been defeated. Life had triumphed. The room was immersed in silence, broken only by the sound of restless footsteps. The disciples were gathered, but fear hung heavily in the air. The news brought by Mary Magdalene had stirred their hearts, but doubt still hovered over them like a thick cloud. Peter paced back and forth, his eyes marked by lack of sleep. He seemed to carry the weight of guilt that consumed him. John, sitting in a corner, stared at the floor, while others whispered, trying to make sense of what Mary had said. "How can we believe this?" questioned Bartholomew. "She says she saw him, but what if she's mistaken? Or worse, What if it's a trap set by the priests? Before anyone could answer, an unexpected sound was heard. The locked doors did not open, yet I was there, standing in the midst of them. The expression on their faces changed instantly, from shock to fear. Some stepped back, others stood frozen. "Peace be with you," I said, my voice gentle but firm. They looked at me, incredulous. The silence was so deep I could hear their breaths quickening. "It is I continued, raising my hands so they could see the nail marks. "Look at my hands and my feet. Touch me, and know that I am not a spirit, but that I have truly risen." Peter fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Lord, I denied you 3 times. I am not worthy to be in your presence." I approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Peter, rise. What's past is past. You are the rock, and upon you I will build my church. Go and strengthen your brothers." Thomas, who had been beside him, remained still, arms crossed, his expression filled with doubt that could not be ignored. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger in the wounds, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." His voice was firm but laden with pain. I slowly approached him, extending my hand. "Touch, Thomas. Do not fear. See and believe." He hesitated for a moment, but finally extended his hand, touching the marks in my hands and side. His eyes filled with tears. "My Lord and my God," he exclaimed, falling to his knees. "Because you have seen me, you have believed," I said, smiling. "Blessed are those who have not seen, yet still believe." At that moment, fear dissipated, giving way to joy. The faith of my disciples was restored, and they knew the empty tomb was more than a sign. It was the beginning of something greater. As my disciples celebrated in secret, on the other side of the city, the religious leaders were in a panic. The news of the empty tomb had spread quickly, and they called for an urgent meeting in the temple. "This cannot get out of hand," said the high priest, his voice heavy with anxiety. "If people believe he has risen, everything we've done will be in vain." A Roman soldier was brought before them. He was still pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Report what happened," ordered the high priest. The soldier hesitated, his eyes revealing internal conflict. "There was an earthquake," he began, "and then a bright light. We couldn't withstand it. We fell as if dead. When we woke up, the stone was moved, and the tomb was empty. The silence in the room was oppressive." The religious leaders exchanged concerned glances. Finally, the high priest approached the soldier, holding a bag of coins in his hand. "You will tell the people that the disciples came by night and stole the body while we were sleeping. These coins will be enough to ensure your silence. And if the governor hears of this, we will make sure you are not punished." The soldier looked at the bag, then at the high priest. He knew what was being asked was a lie, but fear and greed spoke louder. He took the coins and left without a word. Meanwhile, among the disciples, doubt still lingered. Though they had seen me, the task before them seemed impossible. Peter, especially, struggled to understand what this all meant. "How are we going to take this message to the world?" he asked John as they walked through the courtyard of a house in Jerusalem. "We are just fishermen. Who will listen to us?" John placed a hand on Peter's shoulder. "Don't forget what he said, Peter. He promised we would be ready. We must trust in that." Even so, the weight of the mission was evident. Opposition would not come only from the religious leaders, but from many who would rather believe the lie than the truth. I knew my disciples would need more than courage. They would need something divine to accomplish the task set before them. And so, while the religious leaders conspired and the disciples prepared, the world was about to be shaken once more, not by the force of swords, but by the power of faith and the Spirit that would soon come. It was a clear morning on the hills of Galilee. The sun rose on the horizon, casting golden light on the landscape around us. The disciples were gathered, still a bit uncertain, but something had changed in them. The fear that once paralyzed them was beginning to give way to a quiet, yet growing, determination. They knew that this encounter would be decisive. I rose in their midst, looking at each one. Peter, still marked by guilt, but now stronger. John, calm and thoughtful. Mary Magdalene, with her face illuminated by unwavering faith. And Thomas, who had left his doubts behind, but still carried a searching look, as though wanting to understand the depth of what he was living. "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth," I began, my voice echoing through the valley. "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." The disciples listened in silence, but the impact of my words was evident. Some, like John and Mary, smiled, understanding the privilege of the call. Others, like Peter and Bartholomew, seemed to ponder the weight of the mission. I knew the challenge would be immense, but I also knew they would not be alone. Peter was the first to speak. "Lord, how will we do this? We are simple men, fishermen, tax collectors. Who will listen to us? How will we face the leaders and rulers?" I approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Peter, it does not depend on you alone. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and he will give you the power and the words. Do not be afraid. What I have planted in you will flourish." As I spoke, I could feel their doubts diminishing. The promise of the Spirit was a reminder that success would not depend on their strength, but on the faith and divine presence that would be with them. Still, I noticed some carried unspoken questions. I gave them time to absorb my words, observing how understanding grew in their hearts. When the sun began to set, I gathered them all for one final moment of prayer. Each one, in their own silence, surrendered themselves to the mission. At the end, Mary Magdalene approached, her eyes shining. "Rabbi," she said, "I know you are always with us, but we will still miss you." Her words deeply touched everyone. I smiled at her and the others. "I will never be far. When you feel the weight, remember my words. I have overcome the world. You will overcome as well." As I walked down the hill, alone this time, I gazed at the horizon, where the sky began to turn orange and gold. The beauty of that moment was a reflection of the new creation that was beginning. It wasn't just my resurrection, it was the promise of something greater, something eternal. I looked back at the disciples who were now scattering to their tasks. They were a small group, but within them was a fire no one could extinguish. Peter carried the strength of a leader who had learned from his mistakes. John, with his heart full of love, would be a pillar for many. Mary Magdalene, transformed by the power of forgiveness, would be a faithful witness. And even Thomas, whose initial doubt had made him stronger, now walked with unshakable faith. My mind drifted to the moments when it all began. The waters of the Jordan, where John the Baptist proclaimed the arrival of the kingdom. The miracles, the crowds, the times when I taught about the Father and love. Everything converged to this moment, when life triumphed over death. But I also remembered the struggles. The doubts of those who followed me, Judas' betrayal, the abandonment in Gethsemane. Even those moments, full of pain, had been essential. Every step brought me here, to this point where the story would not only be told, but lived by those who believed. My reflection was interrupted by a vision of the future. I saw the impact of the resurrection message spreading across the world. The disciples would face unimaginable challenges, persecutions, imprisonments, even death. But in every situation, they would stand firm, because they had seen, heard, and felt the truth. I also saw the impact on the hearts of those, like you, who would hear this story. How it would transform lives, bringing hope where there was despair, faith where there was doubt, and life where there was death. Every heart that opens to the resurrection will carry a flame that will never go out. Now, I turn my gaze to you. What will you do with this story? You may doubt, like Thomas. You may fear, like Peter before the cross. Or you may choose to believe, like Mary in the garden. The resurrection is not just about me. It's about all of us. About you. About the life you can live with the certainty that death is not the end. As the stars began to shine in the sky, a deep peace filled me. The mission was just beginning, but I knew the Father was in control. The resurrection was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written with love and hope, through all those who chose to believe.